he very much sees this conflict as transactional. He very much does not understand war. He doesn't have a military background. The only way that we're going to get to some type of peace is if there are more sticks applied to Russia. Right now, it's been all carrots.
You have become deeply involved in supporting Ukraine, traveling here regularly and working directly with Ukrainian soldiers and foreign volunteers. What first drew you to Ukraine, and why did this war become such a personal cause for you?
So I think for many Americans, we were watching the full-scale invasion happen in real time from our living rooms. And I've told this story before. I was a paratrooper. Both of my parents were paratroopers. And I grew up with this idea that paratroopers were meant for liberation, that when someone conducted a military operation and was paratrooping into a country, it was to free the population. It wasn't to oppress. And I can still remember seeing film of open canopies, parachutes over Hostomel during the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and recognizing that not only this was the opposite of everything I believed in, that these paratroopers were coming to oppress, they were coming to occupy, not to liberate, that this was truly, for my generation, the biggest good versus evil fight there could possibly be. And so from that very beginning, I wanted to be involved. I'm very grateful for the two founders of the foundation that I run, because they felt the same way. They felt that as Americans, we absolutely had to show up and demonstrate our commitment to freedom, to sovereignty, to territorial integrity, to our values, to all of those different things.
And your father, he, of course, was also deeply involved in trying to resolve this war. And what's interesting is that during his work, we've seen a lot of reports that Russia allegedly tried to sideline him from the peace talks. Do you believe those reports had something to do with what was really happening behind the closed doors?
I do. I mean, I think that it's very clear. So my father is also his background goes all the way back for many, many years in the military. He was part of a green light team. You probably don't know what that is, but green light teams were special forces teams and our U.S. special forces whose responsibility was to carry a backpack nuke. So a portable nuclear weapon. And these green light teams, that's what they were called. These green light teams were developed during the Cold War in case something happened. And so my father is very much steeped in the history of the region. He understands the history of the Soviet Union, the history of Russia, the collective conscience of how Putin thinks and how Russians think. And so I think that was very frightening for the Russians, that he knew very well from the beginning this was not going to be an easy process, and certainly that they were not interested in some type of immediate or balanced or just peace. And so I think that the Russians were very afraid and frightened. And I think that we should always give our enemies or our adversaries credit, because I think underestimating them is very dangerous. They knew this. And so they used what they are very good at, their human intelligence, their psychological pressure, their information operations, to sideline him very early. And they were very successful. And I do hate to say, I think, unfortunately, or actually, I'm not going to apologize for that. My support, my love of Ukraine was part of that, because, everyone knows how close I am with my father, and they also know how I feel about Ukraine and about this war. And so they were able to utilize all of that in a way that was, this is where I will apologize, unfortunately, quite successful. My wish had been that America would have said, Russia, you don't get to dictate our negotiators. You don't get to decide who's at the table and who isn't. This is our country, our sovereignty. But as you're saying, unfortunately, that just didn't happen.
Yeah, actually, we've learned that he's planning to step down in January. And what I want to ask you, do you believe that was entirely his decision, or did the way negotiations evolved force his hand to actually step down?
So I always say, I never speak for my father. I never speak for him at all. He's actually leaving December 31st. So he's done at the end of this month. I think for him, the way things that have progressed have been challenging. I mean, that's widely reported. Things have been difficult. And I think this is an opportunity for him to step away and try to assist in different ways. So I'm sure he'll have a lot to say for himself when the time is right. I'll let him speak for himself. I would just say that I know that he remains committed to a sovereign Ukraine, to a free Ukraine, to the Ukrainian people. And his experience on the ground has been exactly what mine is. He's fallen in love with Ukraine, with her people, and what it means to stand against an aggressor invader nation.
What's also interesting, you publicly said that you voted for President Trump 3 times. Do you believe Donald Trump, he has enough understanding of real causes of this war, and he does understand what could possibly be the way to end it.
So I think the president, and I've spoken very publicly about my support for the president. I've spoken very, very publicly about how I even worked for the president in 2020. And so I think the thing is about the president is that you do have to understand his psychology. He very much sees this conflict as transactional. He very much does not understand war. He doesn't have a military background. He doesn't understand why Russia would send millions of her people to be slaughtered. And he just doesn't understand that. And so for him, he does think it's as simple as stop the killing. People don't want to be dying. Just end it. The economy in Russia is doing poor. Let's just end it. And that's how his brain works. And so to your point earlier, I don't think he's being served well by some of his advisors. I think some of his advisors are trying very hard to make sure he appreciates the significance of the history of this region. And I think some are not. And I think some have, unfortunately, not set the president up for success because they haven't been able to effectively communicate how significant this conflict is for our national security. And I say this a lot as well. It's actually not, it's all about Ukraine, and it's also not about Ukraine at all. For American safety and security, it's critically important. And I just don't think those dots have been effectively connected. And then for those who are kind of solely focused on the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of domestic things happening in the US. And I think this is important for your readers, your listeners to understand. For many Americans, the war in Ukraine is very, very, very low on the list of priorities for the president. And so, for those that are steeped in this every day, that care very deeply, we obviously want more attention, we want more action, but it's a misreading of American domestic politics right now. It just unfortunately isn't very high on the list. So that's a long way of answering your question. I wish he better understood this. I wish his advisors were better advising him. Now, that being said, I will say there was this kind of very splashy Vanity Fair article that just came out about Susie Wiles, his chief of staff. And in it, she admits that the president recognizes Putin is not interested in peace, and that recognizes that he wants all of Ukraine. So I do think it's beginning to seep in. But unfortunately, as you and I both know, time in war is a very dangerous thing. It means more blood, more lives. And so I just wish it would happen faster.
Yeah, it's actually almost a year as Donald Trump is trying to broker a peace settlement. What do you believe is the main obstacle for peace right now? As a person who understands the situation in Ukraine and the power dynamics in the US.
So I think that, I will always say the biggest obstacle is Putin, right? Obviously, that's very, very clear. He doesn't want a peace. He is utilizing this process to protract time. You and I, before we came on air, were talking about the power situation in Ukraine. He's using time as a way to erode the will of the population, attempt to break the resilience of the Ukrainian people, increase his power at the negotiating table by taking more land. All of this is a well-known Russian tactic. It's a well-known Putin tactic. And so I think the biggest obstacle is always going to be Putin. He does not want peace. He does not want, and the idea that if we just give him the Donbass, if he just takes the Donbass, he's going to be satisfied, is again a complete misunderstanding of Putin's psychology. That's what happened with Obama. It was just give him Crimea. It'll be fine. He won't want anything else. Well, here we are, 10 years later, and this is exactly what's happened. And so he's the biggest obstacle. And there are so many other dynamics at play, and I don't want to oversimplify the complexity of the situation, right? We have the EU, who is doing okay in this situation, but certainly I have been very vocal as well about Europe needs to do more, right? We just saw the 90 billion given to Ukraine. They didn't use the frozen assets. There's a lack of kind of commitment to this conflict in a way that could turn the tide. So that's not necessarily an obstacle to peace, but I think certainly it's an obstacle to giving Ukraine a better hand at the negotiating table.
You served in Afghanistan as a young US Army officer. And after the US withdrew from Afghanistan during the Biden administration, you called it a betrayal. And what's also interesting, the Trump administration, they suggested that they might withdraw from the peace process and to eventually withdraw from supporting Kyiv altogether. Would you consider that a betrayal as well?
So I think absolutely, right? This has been my frustration all along. The reason why I was so vehemently opposed to the Biden administration policies was one, exactly what you said. I actually was supportive of us leaving Afghanistan. I think we needed to for a whole different variety of reasons we don't have to talk about now. But the way we did it mattered. It was chaotic, and I certainly think that and there's been some open source reporting on this, that this led to Putin's decision to launch the full scale invasion. He recognized the West was weak, decadent, unwilling to commit long term to anything. And so that was part of his thinking as he was determining whether or not he was going to launch the full scale invasion. And so, what I've said all along, and I've said this publicly as well, that this will be more catastrophic, more significant than the fall of Afghanistan if the president or the United States withdraws from the peace process and something catastrophic happens in Ukraine. And by the way, I say that, but catastrophic things are happening every day. We know this. You're living this intimately. I know this, right? The problem is it's not fully in the consciousness of the American people. And that's where I get concerned. It does become very easy for it to feel like the conflict is far away, that things aren't happening, but they are. You and I both know about the cross border that took 50 folks from Sumy a couple of days ago, and then were put through filtration tactics and techniques. That's horrifying, right? That is a truly horrifying thing. And I think if most American people knew that was happening, they would be equally horrified. The problem is they're just not aware of it.
As a Trump voter, do you think the US should do more to pressure Moscow? And do you think there is like a support among Trump voters to use this leverage against Russia more?
So I think absolutely. So first off, I'll speak for myself here. Absolutely. The only way that we're going to get to some type of peace is if there are more sticks applied to Russia. Right now, it's been all carrots. And if you only have carrots, you cannot force anyone to the negotiating table. Again, it fails to appreciate the dynamics on the ground and the history of the region. We absolutely have to be more aggressive. Now, sanctions are working. Sanctions are biting, right? So the cost of oil is down to $34 a barrel. That's very low. That's great. That's fantastic. And it's going to take a long time for the Russian economy to be so significantly impacted. It's going to lead to some type of push at the negotiating table. So this is where I'm a firm believer in doing significantly more from a military perspective in terms of lethal aid in order to force them to the table. You asked about the American people. So the American people and MAGA voters agree. The vast majority of Americans support sending more weapons to Ukraine, do not trust Putin, and do not trust Russia. And so I think, again, this goes back to sometimes I think the president's advisors are not serving him well because they're not telling him how supportive Americans are of making sure that Russia feels the bite at the negotiating table.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. And we see that Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff, he's taking the lead right now in the peace talks. Do you think he's the right person to talk to the Russians? Because, especially in light of the recent reporting that he actually suggested Moscow on how to talk to Trump, do you think he's the right person?
I think that he is a real estate businessman. He's very good at real estate. He's very good at business. Clearly, he has $1 billion. I don't. So he's very good at some things. I think he's very good at talking. I think he's probably exceptional in negotiating business deals. This is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. We do not need businessmen negotiating that, and certainly not if they have interconnected business interests tied to that region and that would benefit from the outcome of this conflict. I don't think that makes us neutral. Not that I ever thought we should be neutral anyway. The US should never be neutral. One, we should put our interests first. And then next, we have a commitment to those that share our values. So we should never be neutral arbiters of anything, in my opinion. And I think that unfortunately, there's a failure to appreciate how Russia operates, again, the history of this conflict, the history of the region. And as a result, I do think we're seeing this protraction. This type, the president said he would solve this war in 24 hours. That's typical Trump bluster, right? He talks about those things all the time. That's his rhetoric. But I do think he thought this would happen much more quickly. And I think it could have if there was the appropriate balancing of carrots and sticks. And unfortunately, Steve Witkoff, I think, believes that the Russians are interested in solving this through the economy. Simply not true. I would also just add one thing for context for those who are maybe not as familiar with American domestic politics. Every administration since Reagan has tried a Russian reset. We think every time that Russia is going to somehow be different if we just do some more economic tying, if we just are kinder, nicer, more respectful. You have Lavrov and Hillary Clinton with a reset button, all is going to be okay. I don't know how many more times we have to get punched in the face to recognize it's not going to happen. They are our adversary. And that actually is a stable thing to recognize they are, in fact, our competitor.
In this latest peace push, the main obstacle appears to be those sweeping Russian demands that they want to get from Ukraine, especially with the territories. In your view, what would a realistic and acceptable peace deal would look like?
An acceptable peace deal, in my opinion, is every foot of Ukrainian land returned to Ukraine. That's unrealistic, unfortunately. I think we have to also acknowledge the reality and the willpower of political players, both in Europe and here in the US. So that's what I wish would happen. But unfortunately, wishes can't exist in the real world. I think the most realistic path forward is a little bit of what you're seeing now, which is making the remainder of the Donbass some type of free economic zone. I will say that is only possible if it's equitable, meaning Ukraine just can't withdraw from there. Russia obviously has to withdraw. What I would prefer to see is a freezing along the current line of contact, an offset buffer zone, so maybe 20 kilometers to each side to create a 40-kilometer buffer zone that's monitored by a multinational, multi-international organization or grouping, and then that be the starting point for negotiations. I very much agree with European leaders on this, that a ceasefire has to come first, that you have to stop the killing, you have to have an enforced ceasefire, and then all of these other things can be negotiated. I think in the midst of what's happening right now, it's very difficult because I think Russia feels time is on their side. I think Russia feels like they have the battlefield momentum, and so they're not going to negotiate in good faith. And so realistically, I do think, unfortunately, we're going to see something like that, some type of free economic zone or buffer around the current line of contact. And I think that would be preferable, that the freezing on the current line of contact, than anything else.
And just to conclude, do you believe President Trump is going to succeed with trying to broker this peace deal anytime soon?
I think he's going to be successful if he finally wakes up to the fact that Putin does not want peace and that he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. I think the other thing that I just want to highlight is that there has been this misrepresentation of Russian strength, capability on the battlefield. I did just mention they do have momentum. I think we have to be very honest and open about that in order to have a true discussion around what that means. And they're not invincible. And they aren't hyper successful. We're talking about meters gained. We're not talking about, huge swaths of territory. And so I think for the president, if he wakes up and realizes that Russian strength has been overstated, that Russia's not actually interested in peace, and he begins to use those sticks that we have at our disposal, I do think he will be successful.
Every day, our journalists are on the ground in Ukraine, witnessing the war, talking to soldiers' families, and people whose stories rarely make international headlines. We don't have a wealthy owner or political backers shaping what we cover, only our commitment to telling the truth. You can go to KyivinDependent.com/membership and support us there.